Welcome to FILO 2020. We are so happy to be here with you. Now, obviously, we were really looking forward to being in the Chicagoland area with all of you face to face, hanging out, having dinner, talking technology, talking church, and finding out together how we can be better at what we do. Unfortunately, as all of you are aware, with the current coronavirus situation, meeting together is just not a possibility this year. However, because of the technology that is currently available to us, the ability to do online streaming, we are able to bring this class, this breakout to you online. And the great thing about that is, while you're sitting there and while you're engaging with this content, you have the ability to make a comment down in the chat. We'll have some folks that are there to interact with you, to answer your questions, make some clarifications, whatever the case may be. We are here for you. This is a learning experience, not just for you, but it's a learning experience for us too. So we'll really appreciate those comments. My name is Peter Fitton. I am a senior design consultant with Clark. Clark is a design build firm. We're located in the Atlanta metro area in Georgia. However, we are nationwide. So many of you I may have already met or interacted with. For those of you, it's great to see you again. And if we haven't met, I look forward to meeting you and hanging out with you and just kind of talking church and how we can do what we do better. As I mentioned a moment ago, we're in this completely new paradigm of online delivery. We're sort of alone together, I think is the common hashtag that you see all over the place. And all of a sudden, almost overnight for most of us, we have had to learn new ways to engage with our audience. We've had to learn with new ways to engage with the people who come to our churches. Many of us have done streaming before, but it's been it's been focused on the worship experience and in the auditorium. Now we're struggling with, how do we not only present our services online, but how do we engage those people as much or as closely to how they were when they were sitting in the auditorium? Now, again, there's also an additional layer of complexity to that, because we have small groups, we have children's groups, we have high school and middle school and all these other groups that we were not serving through online delivery, or at least most of us weren't serving or didn't have a plan to serve those groups through online delivery. Now, again, almost overnight, we had to figure out a plan, and we had to come together and say, what are we going to do for the people in our congregations, the people that we're in charge of shepherding? How do we make that work? So for a number of years, I've done a few of these different types of webinars, a few different sort of video directing tips and techniques, where to start, that sort of thing. And I've been, over the past few weeks, really sort of redefining and rediscovering what I think is important based on the current circumstances, because a lot of what I talked about before had to do with what we were doing in the church at the moment. How do we take what we're doing in the auditorium and effectively put it online? And over the past few weeks, I began to think about, how do we change what we do, not just now in the face of this coronavirus situation that nobody really knows how far it's going to go, how long it's going to go, or what the long-term ramifications are going to be. It's an interesting thing that, being a systems integrator, working for a systems integrator, I have the opportunity to speak with and meet with a ton of churches throughout the year. And every church is different. And everybody has a different sort of philosophy on how we use online, how do we engage with people online. And there were a number of folks that had just decided, it's not really a thing for us. We'd rather have everybody come into the building. We don't want people scattered all over the place. And there was a pretty good reason. I mean, if you listen to, there's a good reason to say, we probably don't need to do streaming. But then all of a sudden, now everybody's doing streaming. So how does that affect what we do? How does that affect what we create? More importantly, how does it affect how we shoot? How does it affect what we use to shoot? How does it affect our location? Now remember, most of those decisions, when we were presenting our services in the auditorium and that was the main focus, most of those decisions were already made. We had our lighting set, we had our camera packages set, we had, our volunteers that came in and they shot the way they shot, the way they were trained, the directors did their thing, and everything was almost sort of autopilot. And then we had to change. So I noticed something, Easter Sunday, I spent the majority of the day watching different churches. And I was so encouraged and so just amazed at some of the creativity and some of the just the ingenuity that people put into Easter Sunday. Now, for all of us that are watching, all of us here, we work in the church. Many of us worked in the church for decades. It's no surprise that Easter Sunday is, it's Super Bowl Sunday for the church, Super Bowl Sunday for the Christians. Now, all of a sudden, we're faced with a scenario where we have to do our Super Bowl, but nobody can come and see it. We need to engage with our folks. We need to tell the story and celebrate celebrate what Easter means, but we can't do that in our buildings. And so it really encouraged me and really helped me sort of reframe my thoughts on, video directing, reframe my thoughts on how we approach production, is the fact that when I started watching on Sunday morning, like I said, I spent most of the day, I just went from church to church to church to church. Because all of a sudden it wasn't just 11 o'clock in the morning at a specific location. I could attend churches all over the world from my couch. And what I saw was productions that were done outside, productions that were done in the dark. I've seen, productions that were just the pastor sitting in his living room. I've seen a few productions actually that I thought, they just blew me away. I really was impressed with the idea where, pastor was standing on stage as if it was any normal Sunday, but instead of having this huge set behind him that showed, depictions of the cross or, other sorts of, set pieces, behind him was just this giant LED wall, and it was this massive Zoom call. There was probably 50, maybe even 100 people just completely surrounding him. And they were interacting in real time with what he's saying. So all of a sudden you hear people online, you're like, yay, amen, clap, all the other stuff that gives this feeling of connection and gives this idea that, hey, you know what, we are alone, but we're still together. And so I was really impressed by that, and I've been watching ever since. And a lot of churches are still doing those same types of productions. It's like, you know what, we're not confined to the auditorium anymore. We're not confined to a studio anymore. We can go wherever we want. We can shoot with whatever we want. So today, what I want to talk about is sort of a baseline. There's a few different production styles. I want to go into some equipment selection, what it means to be, shooting a cinematic style presentation versus a studio style presentation. And I also want to touch on something that's been a huge topic of discussion even before the coronavirus, and that is, how can we get a more cinematic look with what we are presenting? Should we be using studio cameras? Should we be using cinema cameras? What are the differences between all of these things? And how do I make the right decision? Now, before we jump into all that, I want to tell you, I am not here to tell you the right way or the wrong way to do production. That is completely up to you. My goal today is to highlight some of the differences between production styles. I want to spend some time really looking at the differences between, cinema equipment and studio equipment or field equipment, give you an understanding or help you get to an understanding where you can make the decision what to shoot, how to shoot it, where to shoot it, based on your own context, based on your own needs. So that's what we're going to talk about today. It's basically video directing, and the idea here, I'm going to go ahead and give you the bottom line before we start out. What I hope that you'll walk away from this is some little pieces of information, some little insights to allow you to create the best show for your audience. So the first thing I've always started talking about when I do these types of presentations is there's a few different production styles that we see, and this is really geared towards the church. This is not really an industry thing. This is just some observations that I've made over the past few years in church production. And the first thing is, and probably most common to all of you, is like image magnification or IMAG. Like that's something that the majority of churches to some degree are doing. Some are clearly well more elaborate than others. Some are just, very simple to the point, get exactly what you need and nothing more. And the idea is that the image mag style, and I'm not talking about specifically how we do it in the church, but just in a very general sense, image magnification is just that. It's taking something that's on stage that your audience can already see and making it larger than life, bringing it closer to the viewer, bringing it closer to the person who's sitting in the back, back few rows, up in the balcony. That's what image magnification is for. It allows the communicator to still communicate in such a way that he's using his facial expressions, his eyes, smaller movements, all of these nonverbal cues that you and I, when we're having conversations, we're able to pick up on. But if we're listening to a speaker who's 90 or 100 feet away from us, it's very difficult to pick up on those inflections and facial expressions and those things. That's really the primary purpose behind image magnification. And again, these are very broad, very sort of general scope items here. The next style or next production style, we're just going to call that broadcast. And that's going to be everything you see on TV. If you're doing a TV show at your church, that's included in that. The defining characteristic here is the audience is not in the room. So unlike the audience member who has a perspective view of the stage, who has the feeling of being surrounded by the audience, is participating in that event, that's not true in a broadcast scenario. In broadcast, you've got a remote audience. They have absolutely no idea what the room looks like except for what you show them. They've got no connection to other audience members. And there's really not much of a connection between them and the speaker either, unless you're very particular about how you shoot and making sure when the pastor is, talking a little softer that you're in and you're bringing focus. You have to be the focus for the remote audience member. And then there's the last one, and I wouldn't even call this a production style. This is more of an observation. This is sort of where we've landed in 90% of the churches, maybe even more. And it's this idea of a hybrid model. It's this, okay, we're going to do IMAG and broadcast. And in reality, it's a compromise between the two. It's a mixture of both, but it's really not ideal for anyone. The reason I say that and what I mean by that is when you're shooting in this compromise style, this hybrid style, you're creating a program that is designed to fill the needs of both an audience that's in the room experiencing the live action and an audience that's completely removed, remote, and has no idea, no context of the building. So what ends up happening is we get an IMAG feed with a whole bunch of wide shots in it, and then we end up with broadcast that has not enough context, not enough audience, not enough wide stage shots, those type of things. And so as I started thinking about this after viewing all of these churches online, it occurred to me that, wait a second, we have been creating this hybrid model. And to be completely honest, I've done these teachings before, and I've even advocated for shooting in this hybrid model. Mainly for budget. There's no such thing as an unlimited budget. Some churches have larger budgets, some churches have smaller budgets. Some churches have more access to, high-level broadcast equipment. Many churches do not. And so a lot of it is driven by budgetary concerns, but it's also driven by, personnel concerns. We run on volunteers. Volunteers are the lifeblood of what we do. We can't do what we do without volunteers. But the other side of that coin is not every volunteer is a professional operator. Most of our volunteers know what we've taught them, and they're great at what they do, but they're not professional camera operators. So I have for many years advocated this hybrid approach, this compromise. And now in the midst of all this coronavirus, everything's closed and we're having to do things, we're having to rethink things, I realize that that's not shooting for any particular audience. That's trying to make everybody happy. And that just doesn't work. So what do we do now? Like I said in the beginning, the bottom line of this whole thing is I want you to evaluate all the tools that you have, all the personnel that you have, and I want you to create a program that's designed for your specific audience. Not one that will work for everybody, but your specific audience. I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but before I do, I want to jump into something that I think is really important, and it will help us all identify sort of the roadmap of where we need to go and how we need to build these programs and these presentations. As you begin preparing for your shoot, I want you to ask yourself a few questions before you actually start. Why am I even making this content? What's the purpose? And when I say why am I making this content, it's not because my media director said so, or because my pastor said so. Like, that's not the reason. That's not the why you're doing it. That may be the motivation, but it's not why. In our current context with coronavirus, the why would be, I need to make this because if I don't, I can't connect with people. I need to build this presentation, or I need to build this program in order to somehow, through the internet, reach through somebody's laptop, bring them into what we're doing, and help them engage with the content. I put it as a separate line, but it's really part of the same question. Why am I doing this content? Who is my audience? Now, I alluded to this a few minutes ago when I started talking about the broadcast model versus the IMAG model versus the compromise model. Define your audience. Who is watching? Now, right now, nobody's watching in the auditorium, but is your audience in the auditorium? Is your audience primarily online? Is your audience going to watch this in a live capacity? Like, is this just straight streaming? Or is this a post-produced program that's going to be aired at a later date? The next question you want to answer, obviously, is this: where am I going to shoot? Now, this question used to be answered for us in the church world because we shot in the auditorium. That's where everything happened. That's where we did worship. That's where that's where our pastors teach. That's where, we give announcements from the stage. Like, everything was really rigidly defined. But what I realized watching Easter services is that so many churches got outside the auditorium. There was a number of churches that decided, you know what, we don't need to use the stage. Let's clear the chairs and we'll use the whole auditorium. I watched a program from a church with some very dear friends that work there, that they set up an entire shoot. And I'm talking I think it was 5 or 6 cameras, huge outdoor lighting. And they did a sunrise Easter presentation outdoors. Now, it was in Florida. If you live in Colorado, you might not be able to do Easter service outdoors at sunrise, but it worked for them. And it was a tremendous, just a beautiful, beautiful production. The next question, again, is how we get what we're looking for. How do we get the content? How are we going to shoot this? Are you doing a pastor in his living room, just one camera, maybe one fill light, got some natural light coming in the window, and that's it? Or are you going to be on the other extreme where you've got, you're doing a multi-camera, cinematic style, outdoor shoot? Like, what does that look like for you? How are you going to shoot? And then finally, the last question, it may seem like the first question, and this is often where we get it wrong. The last question you want to answer is, what exactly am I creating? And what I mean by that is this a feature film? Is this a service that is meant to replace our gatherings together that will be presented online? Is this some sort of special DVD project that's for distribution later on? Is this going to a television network? Like, what exactly am I creating? What type of program am I creating? And once you answer those questions, then you've got a really good foundation that you can start building your production on. And the next thing I want to talk about is some of the considerations that you need to take in mind after you've answered these questions, but before you jump into the actual production. First of all is, what does it need to look like? Like, what is the look that we're going for? Now, when I say look, I'm really talking about, and I'm sort of like giving you a little hint to what's to come later, but the look is, I'm talking about, is this a cinematic look production? Is this a broadcast look production? And we'll talk a lot more about that, what that looks like, what it is, in a few minutes. The second considerations is, how am I going to light this? Are we doing an outdoor shoot? Is this something that we've got to rent a bunch of fixtures for? Do we have these fixtures in inventory? How am I going to light this? Now, a word about lighting. If you're a video guy and you don't understand lighting, you don't know lighting, you've got to learn. And it pains me to say this because I'm a video guy at heart. Lighting is probably the most important aspect of good video. And the reason I say that is all cameras only see reflected light. So if the lighting is not good, the image in the camera is not going to be good. So please spend a lot of time thinking about lighting. If you don't know a lot about lighting, find a lighting director, find an LD, find a lighting designer who can help explain some of the more fundamental objective concepts. Now, I'm not talking about making beautiful pictures on stage and, like color and all of that stuff. That's not really, the live presentation aspect of lighting is very subjective. It's very artistic. But there's a broadcast component to, like, how do I light for camera well? And that's really not subjective. That's very objective. It can be measured. If you're a video guy and you don't have a light meter, go out and get one. Learn how to use it. It will save your life, and it will make your shows look better, and it will make you more confident in what you're shooting and what you're capturing. All right, so enough about lighting. What scene? Where am I gonna shoot this? What is my background? What does my foreground look like? Every part of the image that's gonna be in the camera, what does that look like? And how am I going to manipulate that, or how am I going to adjust that to make it the production that I want? Camera placement is a big thing. Most of the time, this is a decision that's been made for us when the building was built. Cameras go here, here, and that's it. Unless we're dragging cable across the floor, there's not a ton of flexibility usually in the auditorium with camera placement. But once you move outside the auditorium, or once you're doing a show where there's nobody in the auditorium, all of a sudden it doesn't matter when there's cables laying across the floor. You can build your production, you can place your cameras so that they are able to best capture what it is that you're shooting. Lensing is a big deal, obviously. Again, this is one of those areas where, when we're confined to the auditorium, that decision's pretty much been made for us. Our broadcast cameras, our IMAG cameras, they all have the lens that was purchased with them, and that's what we have to work with. But not if we're building a presentation or a production from the ground up. Obviously, in the church world, this next thing is something that's really important to us, is the operator ability. Again, we work with volunteers. Most of them are fantastic, wonderful people. They love what they do, and they're good at what they do, but they're still not necessarily professional camera operators. And so we want to make sure that we are taking their ability into play, and we're going to want to create a production or want to set up the production in such a way that we're not asking them to do something that they are either unable to do or uncomfortable doing. So we want to take that into account. The next thing we have to consider is our timeline. What is it that we're delivering, and how quickly or how much time do we have to deliver it? Are we delivering a program that is a one-shot, straight-to-air, streaming only kind of production, or are we doing a multi-camera, on-location type of shoot where we're going to bring all of that content back into an edit facility, we're going to color grade it, we're going to post it, and then we're going to come up with one package that's going to be shown at a later date? Obviously, those are two very different kinds of productions and two very different timelines. And finally, you need to consider your system limitations. So this also includes, like, what do you have access to? Like, what can be rented locally? What do you personally own as a shooter? Do you have cameras? Do you have lenses? But also, if you are in an auditorium, what exactly are the pieces and parts that are going to limit what you want to do? And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this later also as we get into some of the equipment comparisons when we're talking about cinema cameras versus broadcast cameras. Before we do that, I promised I was going to answer for you, or at least I was going to explain to you sort of the differences between the broadcast look and the cinema look. As an integrator, one of the questions that we get from the majority of our clients is, what's the difference between the cinema look and the broadcast look? I see, this church or that church, like, they have this really cool, cinematic feel to it, and I really want to emulate that, in our auditorium. We want to do what so-and-so is doing, or I love the way, this church's cameras, or I love the way this church's overall production, or this church's streaming. I love the way that looks online. How do we recreate that? So what I want to do for a moment real quick is just look at the difference between the broadcast look, or what we might refer to as the broadcast look, and the cinema look. And I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this. This list is not exhaustive. So I would be really interested to hear from you guys, what is it in your mind that defines the cinematic look, and what is it in your mind that defines the broadcast look? Because these are subjective descriptions. But first, let's move into the broadcast look. So what is that broadcast look? Like, what is that when you say, ugh, I don't like the broadcast look. It's not my thing. It doesn't feel good to me. Like, what is that? So the broadcast look typically is going to be a much deeper depth of field, meaning you're going to have a lot more of the frame in focus. That has to do with the sensor. Typically, the broadcast look is characterized by very flat lighting. It's not moody, it's very flat. You've got key light, you've got fill light, you've got backlight, you've got everything you need to be lit up and everything exposed to the camera. Because remember, the camera only sees reflected light. So you've got a standard, what we call a standard gamma curve. So really what that means is sort of the area, the transition between the darkest parts of the picture and the lightest part of the picture is very smooth. It appears to our eye as being very linear, and it's very pleasing. So there's limited sensitivity to broadcast cameras. You don't get a huge variation in lights and darks. When we're shooting in a broadcast style, we have very typical camera and shot composition, meaning we generally adhere to some of the more specific rules. For instance, the rule of thirds. We're cognizant of the horizon line and the eye line and all of these things that allow us to recreate quickly a well-composed shot. Smooth, realistic motion. Now, this is the thing that I would say the majority of people would tell you this is the thing they don't like, or this is the one thing that turns them off with the broadcast look. So the broadcast cameras run at a much higher frame rate than most cinema cameras are going to shoot at. And what that delivers is a very smooth, some would even describe it as hyper-realistic motion. And it feels a little bit uncomfortable. They don't like that. So a few other things that are common in the broadcast look is usually you've got some sort of tripod stabilization. Cameras don't move a whole lot. That's not entirely true. You've got jibs and steady cams and all that stuff. But for the most part, especially in our churches, what we've got are 3 or 4 tripod mounted cameras. The shots are going to be steady, they're going to be still, they're not going to move, and they're going to look great. You've got a standard frame rate. There's only a couple of frame rates that work in the quote unquote broadcast world. So your 59.94 interlaced, 59.94 progressive. Some people it's still at 720p. That's sort of going by the wayside, but we're even not seeing much in the way of 4K or anything beyond 1080i or 1080p HD. The other thing that you're going to find is that there's really limited motion blur. There's not a ton of settings inside the camera, or at least not on the surface. We'll talk about that more in a minute. But you get a limited motion blur. Again, this is sort of goes back to that idea of this hyper-realistic motion. We've got limited dynamic range. We've got a standard color space. Like every video broadcast shoot is going to shoot in the same color space. Colors are going to be, we're used to seeing them that way. Generally speaking, in the broadcast world, there's no need for color grading. Like all of the color grading, color matching, all of that is done internally inside the camera. And then finally, we've got our standard 16:9 aspect ratio. Very, very seldom will you find something broadcast that's not a 16:9 aspect ratio. So what is it then that defines the cinematic look? Well, that gets a little bit more complicated because this is, again, much more subjective. Some of these terms are a little bit more sort of ethereal and may or may not mean the same thing to every person. But let's talk about a few of them real quick. Cinematic look, when I talk to clients, when they say, I want a cinematic looking camera, what they're really, really asking for is I want a super shallow depth of field. Like I want to be able to, see the person and nothing else behind them. I want this really sexy blur and this beautiful, beautiful shot where my subject is the highlight. Another big part of this cinematic look really has nothing to do with the camera at all, and that's lighting. So lighting for cinema is very different than lighting for broadcast. You've got a lot of times where the scene will be much darker, much more contrasty. That's a decision that is made oftentimes, and it's very difficult to do that live and to do it well. High contrast, increased sensitivity, creative composition, meaning your cinematic productions are generally not bound by the quote unquote rules of composition. You'll see them in there, but you'll also see really beautiful shots that are not, composed quite quote unquote correctly. And it adds to the story. It adds to the beauty of the overall shot. Camera motion is a big deal. Cinematic presentations often have, big camera moves, and they're also helped with that with some advanced camera stabilization, meaning, shots are done on gimbals and super long jibs and, track and dolly and camera cranes and all of these specialized pieces of equipment that allow this camera to move in a really unrealistic way to create this almost dreamlike floating through the presentation and watching what's going on rather than sort of having the presentation happen at you or towards you. Think of the difference between, watching a movie and watching the news. Like the news is coming at you, and when you're watching a movie, you're being pulled into the story. So that's a big difference there. Variable frame rate, adjustable motion blur. You really have a lot more control inside of a cinema camera in terms of how the image looks, what the final product is. There's increased dynamic range. You've got a much wider color space. Almost always, here's something that you've got to consider. Almost always, you're going to require some sort of color grading if you're going to do a cinematic presentation, whether live or in post, especially. There's going to be some sort of color grading, and you're not bound to one aspect ratio. You can use, whatever is available inside of your particular camera. So the next thing I want to do, a lot of the stuff that we just described here as differences between broadcast and cinematic presentations have to do with the sensor of the camera. So we're actually going to break it down. We're going to look at a few different parts and pieces of the camera, but really the idea here is to break down each one of those things that we like or don't like about these looks and try to explain why they are and sort of the pros and cons of each individual thing. So, like I said, the first thing we're going to look at is the sensor. In a broadcast sensor, or broadcast camera rather, your sensor is going to be a 2/3 inch, 3-chip for the most part, but there are some newer models of cameras that are single chip, 3-chip sensor on the broadcast camera. In your cinema cameras, there's too many to list. Sensor sizes vary. I dare you just Google sensor size, Google cinema camera sensor size, and you'll come up with some infographics that show all of the various cameras available and their sensor sizes, and it's daunting. But what does that mean? So what is the difference to us as we're looking at sensor sizes? So before I show you this next slide, I want to tell you a lot of these examples that I'm showing you come from an app called PCAM. So just letter P, C-A-M. I use the Pro version. It is a fantastic app. If you're a videographer, if you're a shooter of any kind, I would encourage you to get this app. It may well be the most expensive app you'll buy. It's about $29.99 right now. And it's incredible. And you'll see some of these shots, this is where they came from. So as we're looking at the sensor size comparison between a 2/3 inch broadcast camera, and for this example, we use the Blackmagic Ursa broadcast camera. It's basically the B4 mount version of their popular Ursa cinema camera, but it works for this illustration. So if you look at the picture here, what you see is a guy and he's standing out on the tarmac in front of an airplane, but there's two boxes here. The red box indicates the field of view of a typical 2/3 inch broadcast camera at about 187 millimeter focal length. And that is indicative of basically a very standard 17 by 7.6 broadcast lens. So that's why I chose that number. The blue box that goes all the way out to the edges of the raster there is the Blackmagic Ursa camera. It's a 4K sensor, obviously much bigger, much larger field of view. Now that's going to come into play a little bit later when we start talking about lenses. But there's one other point I want to make about sensor size and why sensor size is important. If you look at this slide here, what you'll see is two rectangles, and we've divided them up into a bunch of different quadrants. So this is meant to represent a sensor. So on the left, you've got a 2/3 inch HD sensor. On the right, you've got a 2/3 inch 4K sensor. So this is the comparison basically between that broadcast camera and that Blackmagic Ursa camera that has a 4K sensor. So immediately you'll notice there's far fewer squares on the 2/3 inch HD camera, and there's far more on the 4K camera. Why is that important? Well, that's going to play into sensitivity. So each one of those squares represents 1 pixel. The larger pixels are able to gather more light at the same time. The same 2/3 inch sensor that has, that has 4K resolution has much smaller photosites, and it's unable to gather as much light on each photosite given the same amount of time. That's important to understand as you move forward. That's also why the majority of film cameras, cinema cameras, have much larger sensors. They may still only be a 4K sensor, 6K sensor, but they're going to be dramatically larger than a 2/3 inch sensor. So the other thing that the sensor is going to do, and this is important to understand, a lot of us have LED screens on stage. The beautiful thing about having an LED on stage is it can act as a digital set piece. It can act as sort of a teaching prop. It can act as a place to put notes. Like there's really unlimited things you can do with the LED wall. And it's an important part of our presentation. Image sensors don't always respond the same way to an LED wall. And this is important. A 2/3 inch sensor in a broadcast camera separates the light using a prism into red, green, and blue. And then each of those components, red, green, and blue, has its own sensor, and then it's sort of reassembled in the back end. A cinema camera, on the other hand, typically has 1 large chip, and all of the color filtering is done electronically internal to the camera. So this next image is a camera shootout that we did with a client, 2 different cameras, 2 completely different technologies. One was a very traditional broadcast camera. The other was a very nice cinema camera. And what we found is we started our day by setting up a chart, which you can kind of see still sitting on the chair in the image. And we color balanced both cameras to where they were dead on their targets in the chart. We pulled the chart away. We had a person stand up on stage. We turned on the LED wall, and all of a sudden we realized they don't match. The reason they don't match, so if you look at the picture there's a monitor in the foreground, and it has the 2 cameras side by side, and you can see the LED wall sort of off in the background. You see the LED wall, sort of these blue and gold tones, but if you look at the monitor, you look at the left-hand side, that's the cinema camera, and it's displaying those blue and gold tones as like magenta and kind of pinkish, and it's not accurately representing the colors. Even though we charted the camera, it looked, we matched them up, it looked dead on the chart. So what's happening? So this is one of those, you just need to be careful and understand what you're getting. Because of the electronic way that the colors are separated inside the sensor, you have sort of this color reproduction error. But it only happens on very narrow bandwidth color that comes from LED lights or an LED wall. So if you don't have an LED wall, it's probably nothing to worry about. The reason I bring this up is because so many of us have LED walls, and I would hate to see somebody go out and buy a cinema camera, expect it to work some way, and then see it just doesn't match what's on stage. Now, skin tones look great, whatever. But I wanted to show that to you and just reiterate that you want to make sure that you're looking at the camera, especially if you're going to make an investment into a large camera, whether it's broadcast or cinema, bring it into your facility, look at it on your stage, and make sure you're able to get the look that you're going for. So the next thing is the ergonomics of the camera. This is pretty straightforward. A studio camera has rear controls and a big viewfinder up front. A studio camera is designed for live action capture. As an operator stands behind the camera, one hand on his zoom, the other hand on his focus, monitors directly up in front of him. All the camera operator has to worry about is pointing the camera in the right direction, framing the subject, making sure it's focused. Everything else happens sort of behind the scenes, somewhere else with another operator. On the other hand, you have a cinema camera, and cinema cameras can do everything that a studio camera can do with some caveats. So studio cameras, typically you buy a body, you buy a lens, and then you got to buy all the gack that goes onto it to build it up. You need a rail system, possibly a focus wheel, some sort of zoom servo. You can see in this picture, it's a Canon C500, I think, and you've got a recorder strapped to the back of it. You've got a little handle there that's on the back of the camera, but that's really just for positioning. There's no zoom or focus on that handle. And so the ergonomics of control is a little bit different. The reason is a broadcast camera is designed for a live event. It's designed to very quickly and very accurately, acquire your shot and then move on. Whereas a cinema camera originally, and still today, are designed to set up your shot, dial in the lens, dial everything in, then shoot it, capture it, bring it back into an edit facility and edit it. So it's a different workflow, and the cameras are designed around that workflow. Does it mean you can't use a cinema camera in a live environment? Of course not. But it does mean that you have some additional considerations to make. Lensing with a broadcast camera, you have a B4 mount, and that's it. You've got a myriad of different lenses, different focal lengths, different speeds, different sizes. Down from a little bitty, ENG style lens to a huge, sports box lens. That's what you have available to you. I would say, however, you probably have more lens options available to you in the cinema market. However, they're all PL mount, F mount, EF mount, MFT, and then there's a bunch of others too that are available out there. A lot of them are prime lenses, meaning they only have one focal length. You set it up for the shot that you're looking to capture, and that's what you use. Another difference is all broadcast lenses are what you would call parfocal, meaning they will maintain focus throughout the entire zoom travel. Some cinema lenses will do that, some will not, some don't zoom at all. So it's just something to think about here. So going back to our PCAM app, we're gonna look at and try to discover what the difference between focal lengths of that 4K sensor and that 2/3 inch sensor are. So if you look here in the example, you've got our broadcast camera, it's set at 129 millimeters. What does that mean for our 4K sensor? What if I want to get the exact same framing out of a 4K sensor? Well, now all of a sudden I need a little over 300 millimeters. So just a little bit more than double the focal length, double the lens reach to get the same shot. Why is that such a big deal? Well, in our world, in the churches, where do you typically place your two centerline? Back of the room? In our experience, most of our clients have their cameras at or near the back of the room, and that's typically anywhere from, say, 60 feet to over 100 feet away from the subject. In general, to get a really tight, what we would call a bust shot, at 100 feet, you're looking at about 500 millimeters worth of focal length. That's gonna be a big box lens at that point. What if you needed to get that same focal length out of your 4K sensor? All of a sudden, now you need a lens that's 1,000 millimeters. First of all, there's not a lot of those out there. And second, they are really, really expensive. Next thing I want to show you is depth of field. For these next two slides, we're taking the measurements that we just created out of this focal length difference, and we're going to look at the focal length, or not the focal length, but the depth of field in these two scenarios. So now if you look at this next slide, what you'll see, this is a depth of field calculator. Now the reason why this is important, because this is the one thing that everybody loves about the cinema camera, is the shallow depth of field. So if we're looking at first this broadcast camera, remember we're at 129 millimeters, and I chose a middle ground of about 75 feet for this example. So at 129 millimeters, 75 feet, we are roughly going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of about 5 feet of depth of field, which means, if you place your subject right in the center of that, you're going to have roughly a little over 2 feet in front and a little over 2 feet in back that he can move or she can move without going out of focus. Beyond that, you're out of focus. So the next one is our Blackmagic camera with the 4K sensor. Again, remember we had to be a little over 300 millimeters, 301.6 to be exact. We're still out here at 75 feet, but what you'll notice now, right there where it says total depth, we're at about 1 foot 8 inches or so. So that's a dramatically reduced depth of field just by changing the sensor size. We've changed the sensor size, we had to change the focal length, we have a shallower depth of field. So what do those shots look like then on these different sensors? Not from a depth of field standpoint, but just from a framing standpoint. So if we go back to our 129 millimeter baseline, this is our 2/3 inch camera, broadcast, 129 millimeters at 75 feet. It's kind of a typical medium shot. But that, again, that's at the end of the lens. It's not really where we want to be, but this is just for the sake of the example. If we look at our Ursa camera, same 129 millimeters, same 75 feet, now we're in a full shot. Obviously that may be what you're looking for, it may not be what you're looking for, but it's something to take into consideration. Sensor size and lensing really, really, really matters. So the next thing we've got controls for the cameras. Typically in a cinema camera, all of the controls are on board, meaning, again, go back to where we talked about, you set up your shot, you dial it in, you acquire it, goes to tape, goes to color grading, goes to editing, and then you end up with a finished product. A multicam cinema camera shoot is even more difficult because, again, all of the camera control, all the color control is either going to be on the camera or it's going to be done in post color grading, both of which are going to require, an operator to manually match up all of the colors, all of the frame rates. Basically every aspect of that shot needs to be matched up at some point. This is what the camera control for a typical broadcast camera looks like. This is operated by the video op. If you're in the truck world and if you've been on a truck, obviously this is the video op. Most of the time in our world we call it the shader. I've heard a few other terms, but those are pretty much predominantly the two, video op or shader. This person's going to be responsible for exposure. They're going to be responsible for your black level, your white level, and your gamma level. So gamma meaning midtones, sort of how the picture transitions from dark to light. And they're also going to be in charge of color balance. All of that can be accessed by this panel from a remote location, usually in the control room, with the help of a video scope and a monitor. Some other differences between cinema cameras and broadcast cameras is just going to be their dynamic range. And again, this goes to why we light broadcast cameras very flat. They're limited in their dynamic range, 5 to 6 stops at most. There's some cameras now that perform better than that, but in reality, once it's all normalized and sort of squashed down, 5 to 6 stops is really what you're looking at in terms of dynamic range. Compare that with a cinema camera's 13 to 15 stops of dynamic range. Now you may be saying, well, gosh, that is like a tremendous difference. Why wouldn't I just use the cinema camera? Well, in order to take advantage of dynamic range, every component in your system, from the camera all the way through to the display, has to be able to support that higher dynamic range, or you won't see it. Now, where it comes in is if you're shooting something in editing, it gives you a lot more flexibility in color grading and creating an image that looks the way you want it to look. So this is sort of a really quick, I don't want to talk about HDR and dynamic range an awful lot, but I want you to understand that there is a difference. Standard dynamic range is what is in the majority of broadcast cameras today. We've got newer models that are coming out with HDR and some other stuff, but for the most part, broad generalities, broadcast cameras are still operating in standard dynamic range, which is about 8 bits. What that means is you have 256 values from absolute black to absolute white. The next step up from that, the majority of cinema cameras currently today, not including like the REs and the Reds and those cameras of the world, but the what we're shooting on, the DSLRs and the smaller format cinema-based cameras are typically running 10-bit, which gives them about 1024 values between absolute black, absolute white, and then of course the next step after that is 12-bit. That's part of the 2020 color space. There's 4,096 values in that. Again, just want you to understand sort of the differences between the two. The next thing is the color gamut. So color gamut, all that means is just a fancy way of saying this is what colors are available to you for your picture. In the broadcast world, we are 100% in the Rec 709 or BT 709 color space. Most cinema cameras are at least shooting in DCI P3, which is an expanded space. I think everybody's trying to get as close to 2020 as possible. We're not quite there yet, but it is on its way. You've seen this chart. This is a typical CIE chromaticity chart. What you'll see is the little white triangle there. That represents 709. That's the space, the color space that we're using to create all of what we're doing inside of a broadcast camera. The next lineup is sort of grayish triangle. It's a little bit bigger. That's going to be your DCI, your P3 space. That's your typical cinema space. And then the larger sort of teal blue triangle there represents what we hope to achieve, what is part of the BT 2020 standard, but is not yet reproducible. That's where we're hoping to get. This just shows Rec 709 and Rec 2020 on a vector scope, and it just shows you just sort of how much broader that color space is. This next slide really is my favorite because it really shows you exactly what the major difference is between those two color gamuts. The reason for that is it's plotted in 3 dimensions. As you can see, 2020 has a larger footprint, on the X and Y or little x, little y axis. But you can see the color volume plotted on the capital Y axis, capital meaning luminance, is a lot more. Rec 709, we're looking at 100 nits of brightness. 2020 brings us all the way up to 10,000. We're not quite there yet, but that's where we're headed. So I wanted you to take a look at that because it really helps explain this color theory thing. Frame rate, broadcast cameras typically operate at 5994i or p. Again, sometimes still 720, a couple different variation in frame rates there, but for the most part, it's 5994i or p. In a frame rate for the cinema cameras, you really have your choice. Anywhere from 24p, I think some cameras will even shoot lower than that, although it'll end up being kind of choppy, up to 120p or even greater, I think, if you're doing some slow motion work. Finally is the idea of shutter. Now, shutter is something that we just generally don't use in the broadcast world. It's available on all broadcast cameras, but by default, it's typically either turned off or it's set to equal the frame rate. In a cinema camera, however, shutter is actually used to control light coming into the camera. It's used to adjust depth of field. It's used to make all sorts of adjustments to the image without changing either the aperture or the ISO value. And that's really important. If you're interested in that, it's something I would encourage you to explore. I would also encourage you to explore, however, if you have broadcast cameras, especially now since our buildings are empty, take some time and play with the shutter because I really think it's an unused tool. It's a really powerful tool, but it's unused in most scenarios because we just don't turn it on. So finally, I want to leave you with a few thoughts. We've talked about the differences between equipment and the parts and pieces of the cameras and how they look different, why they're different, maybe most importantly. We also talked a lot about spending time understanding why you're shooting, understanding who you're shooting for, and understanding and defining, what the program is all about. Now I want to encourage you a little bit. This scenario, this season of coronavirus, this is not forever. We are going to come back together. We are going to gather in our buildings, and we are going to sort of get back to some new normal. But what I really, really want you guys to take away from this, what I really want you guys, not just from this, this talk, but from the past few weeks or months that you've been having to create content in a far different context, I would encourage you to continue doing that. I really believe that as we begin to go back to church, as we begin to gather together, that we are going to see a dramatic difference in how the church engages with people online. You have an opportunity as a shooter, as a director, as a media person to help shape how people receive the message in their home, especially people who will never ever come to your church. They'll never come through the doors, but you can reach out to them. You can be in their living room. And I would encourage each and every one of you, as much as you possibly can, when you go back, continue to treat internet as a separate production. Continue to treat internet as a separate audience and build a show specifically for them. The same way that you do for the people sitting in your auditorium, the same way that you do for the people who are watching at other campuses. If you're a multi-site organization, I encourage you to take some of what you've been doing and continue it on and make it part of your new process and your new DNA. Again, my name is Peter Fitton. It's been my pleasure to be here with you today. I hope to interact with you in the comments. Have a wonderful day.